Hello. You're listening to the Chronicles, the podcast of the Centre for Viking and Medieval Studies at Aarhus University. I'm Richard Cole. In Northern Europe, paganism, the worship of gods such as Óðinn, Þórr or Freyr, was in full retreat by the 950s. The last pagan king probably died in Sweden in the 1080s. By the early 1100s, virtually everybody in Scandinavia, so far as we can see, would have thought of themselves as Christian. Now, these Christians continued to tell myths of the old gods, now transmuted from religion into art, song, literature and folklore. Mythology survived, indeed some Christian intellectuals treasured it, but paganism was extinct. For some 8 centuries, what had once been a matter of belief was transmuted into a matter of art, folklore and literature. But in the 1800s, something strange began to happen. Especially in Germany, but also in the British Empire, Scandinavia and the Netherlands, intellectuals began to develop a keen interest in long-dead pre-Christian religious beliefs. This interest was frequently connected to Völkism, an ethno-nationalist movement that sought to locate the true heritage of the Germans or the other Germanic peoples. Völkism proliferated in a number of movements and scholarly tendencies generally associated with far-right politics. Amongst some Völkisch thinkers, a desire emerged to recreate paganism. Today, both scholars of pre-Christian religion and neo-pagans who see themselves as apolitical or even anti-fascist nonetheless owe a considerable intellectual debt to these Völkische thinkers. Joining me to talk about the Völkisch project to rediscover and revivify paganism and the implications it has for both researchers and self-avowed neo-pagans today is Lukas Rösli, Junior Professor für Skandinavistik and Medievistik, Nordeuropa-Institut at Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin. Lukas, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Richard.
I'm going to start by asking you a question I've been asking all the guests on this podcast. And I want to start by maybe taking a step away from our material and just asking you, what does the Middle Ages mean to you? Is there some sort of medieval spirit? Is there some sort of sense of continuity to the period of the Middle Ages?
When we talk about the Middle Ages, we would have to talk about what are Middle Ages as such. I think there is, of course, a period or epoch that stretches from late antiquity to what we call modernity. But is this the Middle Ages we are observing as medievalists? I don't think so. What we do, research and analyze, are Middle Ages created in the 19th century. Then scholars started to find texts, editing these texts, and actually creating this, what we call the Middle Ages.
Yes, it's a good point, isn't it? No one in the Middle Ages walked around saying, gosh, isn't it great being in the Middle Ages?
Exactly.
Exactly. That's a periodization that we've come up with. Well, if we get down to the matter at hand, I want to start by getting some pieces on the board, if I can. What can we say with any degree of certainty about these pre-Christian religions or a pre-Christian religion in the Viking Age? What did people believe before the coming of Christ here in Northern Europe?
It's again a question of what we consider to be actually significance. What is real for whom? And from my point of view, in Scandinavian studies, at least, the so-called Viking Age would be pre-medieval. So we have the Scandinavian Middle Age, which starts with Christianity.
Right.
So are Viking Ages Middle Ages?
And yeah, right. I mean, here in Denmark, of course, people in Scandinavia, people would say no, right? If you go to a museum here, you'll see a Viking Age normally defined from something like 800 to 1,000, something like this, give or take 50 or 100 years. And then suddenly the Middle Ages start, right? Whereas, as you can hear from my accent, I'm from the British Isles. And we learn that the Viking Age is just a thing that happens during the early Middle Ages. Right? So, of course, these periodizations are kind of artificial. But, okay, if we were to talk about this time before the 900s, something like that here in Scandinavia, is there much we can say about the religious beliefs of these people? I don't know. We don't have to call them Vikings, but we'll call them Scandinavians of what we call the early Middle Ages. What can we say about their beliefs? What gods did they worship? Or how did they worship? What did the priesthood look like? These questions we can answer.
Probably we can't, because they didn't write. They didn't have a writing system besides runic writing, which they didn't use to write down practices of everyday life as religion would be. So we have artifacts. We have archaeological artifacts, but those are still. They don't talk. They don't have labels to them, what they're used for, how they were used in praxis. So we need a lot of thinking, interpretation, and I think a lot of fantasy to create an actual religion out of what we can find. Because afterwards we do have texts about...
They're from after the Viking Age, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're written by Christian scribes.
Yeah. Mostly in the late 1100s, 1200s, mostly in Iceland, right? This is the sort of material we're talking about here. Yeah. Okay, so we've got a sort of bit of a source critical problem here. I suppose one question underneath that I would like to ask you, and I have a suspicion, I know we're going to get more of the same answer perhaps, but to what extent did people who followed this religion have a name for it? To what extent did they define themselves against Christianity? We try to look at their practices and say, oh, they're doing some sort of religion here. We call it paganism, right? Is there a sense that they had that sense of themselves, a sense they were doing something different?
It's often said that the only self-labeled name they used would be Seidr. But again, this is a word used in sagas and other medieval Christian literary texts.
Sidr, like a custom?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
And
okay.
It was just the old custom, but again, that's what Christians called neo-paganism, or pagans at that time.
Yeah, and I think necessarily with a term like this Old Norse fornsiðr, this old custom, necessarily you don't start calling it the old custom until a new custom comes along.
Exactly.
It's not a sign that these people had much of a self-identity, a religious self-identity before the coming of Christianity, perhaps.
And as we lack all written sources, we can't say if they called Óðinn a god before. We do have, for example, picture stones.
Yeah.
Where we have paintings or carvings painted on it. And there we see a small guy with a hammer in his hand and a foot through a boat. So, of course, we interpret this as being Thor fishing the Midgard serpent. But is it? We do know this story from like 400 years later.
Right. Yeah. You're talking about Snorri Sturluson's Edda, I think. Here, right?
For example, yeah.
Yeah.
Or also Himiskvida in the Poetic Edda.
Right, of course. And, listeners, we have actually had a previous episode about Snorri Sturluson and the Eddas, so make sure to check that out. But okay, so we've got these kind of quite serious source critical problems. I'm going to let us get away soon from trying to say something about pre-Christian religion in Scandinavia, but I'm going to ask you one more question about it, if I can, or bring one more thing up. How does it go away, right? How does it die? Why do we end up in this problem, this source critical problem in the first place? I suppose the question I'm really trying to ask here is, what factors lead to the decline of this religion? How does it exit stage right?
It's probably like everywhere in Europe when Christianity arrived. Christianity was quite a large economical factor, and kings used their sword to bring Christianity up on their people. So it was physical violence, probably economical violence, and it was a quite dogmatic belief system. So if you think of pre-Christian religions as something rather not actually individual, but scattered in different belief systems, if something rather dogmatic comes in, which every Christian can believe in, and all the people in Europe, this has something quite formative to it.
Yes, it does sometimes seem to me that, so whatever it is we can say about paganism, that the paganism versus Christianity conflict, paganism sort of turns up with a knife to a gunfight, right? I mean, Christianity comes in with all of these big, lofty ideas about legitimating power and what happens to you in the next life. And as you say, it's dogmatic, and paganism seems, from what we can tell, a lot more diffuse, right? When we imagine this, we're normally imagining a very localized system, right? Where, even inside of what we think of as Denmark today, there could have been huge variation in belief, presumably.
Probably, yes. Yeah.
Okay. So I think we've got some stuff about paganism on the board, or at least what we don't know, rigidly defined areas of doubt and uncertainty. I want to look at the other character we're going to be talking about today, and that's this Völkism. I mean, what is Völkism for people who haven't heard of that? What are its roots?
The roots of the Völkische Bewegung or Völkisch movement as this hodgepodge of nationalist, anti-Semitic, racist, and reformist religious ideas is known in the German-speaking country, can be found in the end of the 19th century.
Okay, so late 1800s, right?
Yeah. In the German Empire and the German-speaking part of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, in particular, a very specific interpretation of the word Volk, or people, emerged at the time. This people was regarded as a unit of people with the same language, culture, origin, and race. Völkisch thus denoted an attitude in which the people were regarded as a completely homogeneous entity. So, which in the sense of the German people was distinguished from all the other peoples by the aforementioned factors of language, culture, origin, and race.
So if I can interrupt you there, when we're talking about this Völkisch movement, we are keeping it focused on essentially German-speaking countries. Could you be a British Völkisch thinker thinking about Völk, in the notion of the people in relation to English identity, for example? Is that a thing that could happen, or is it really strictly defined a German-speaking phenomenon?
I think the difference with Britain is that the British Empire already spread out at the time into different areas of the world,
right,
and had, in this sense, contact with other cultures. And I think in the Victorian era, of course, there was a belief that British are best people in the world.
Oh yeah, that's not gone away, I don't think. Yeah.
It probably still is. But in Germany, there was something very backwards leaning, where you have like our own people. That's what the Völkisch means. It's really the German ideal, the German essence.
They're creating an identity that's not necessarily been very strong before. Is that right?
Exactly.
Say? Okay. Yeah. All right.
And that's at the same time, the early 19th century or late 18th century, early 19th century, when Germany was still very scattered and very, very fragmented.
Yeah.
Something like this, like the Deutsche Geist, the German spirit, came up by Herder. And so those intellectuals, they started to define themselves as being German in opposition to mainly the French.
Okay, yeah. And that leads me a bit to my next question about this Völkisch thinking or Völkism. How far is it an abstract academic idea? How far is it a few nerds and poets in universities churning this stuff out? And how far is it a popular idea in the 1800s? Could you sort of walk down the street in, I don't know, Hamburg or Darmstadt or wherever, and, ordinary people would be discussing Völkisch ideas? Or is it something that's really, really sort of nerds at the universities?
I think it's with like all those post or late industrialization mass movements, it's an intellectual thing. Yeah. That gives you the basis that goes down to everything else and should be popularized within the normal people.
Okay, so it filters down through society.
Exactly.
At least ideally.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, so I think we've got some sort of definition of this Völkisch thought, and we've got our paganism. I suppose I now want to start to try to mash them together if I can. where does this jump happen amongst Völkisch thinkers from studying paganism while still self-identifying as Christian? I mean, I'm assuming lots of these early Völkisch people, at least the early ones, do think of themselves still as Christians here in the late 1800s. Where does this jump happen from actually, being a Christian who studies paganism to starting to say, no, you know what, I'm not actually a Christian, I am a pagan, I have rediscovered paganism? Where does that jump happen?
I think that's at the brink of the century, when a somehow complex or growing complexity in the world starts to emerge, and cities get bigger, the people get more diverse, and some intellectuals then start to criticize modernity.
And when we talk about modernity, I mean, just so we can, it's a sort of word that we bandy around here at the university without really thinking about it. But can we define it more particularly? Is it sort of, technological advancement, it's living in cities?
Exactly. It's technological advancement. It's mass media, like newspapers, that starts to grow at the time. Okay. It's like industrialization, where you have larger cities with transport systems and so on. Right. And those people, they feel like outrooted from their original German life, which they imagined as being back on the countryside, living their proper German way on their soil.
Right. And of course, if you're going to do that, you've got to practice an actual German religion, I assume. Is this the mode of thought?
Yeah.
And that leads you fairly quickly to paganism rather than Christianity.
There were two main movements in the Völkisch movement that, or path. One was the one that tried to find a German Christianity. They called Jesus an Aryan. So they thought of him not as being Jewish or Christian, but as being Aryan. And they tried to link Christianity back to something very old. Older than actual Christianity is.
Right. And
to make it German.
This is sort of something that rears its head during the Nazis, right? During the Nazi period, the Deutsche Christen, the German Christians who tried to Aryanize Christianity. Nice, strapping, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus and that kind of stuff. Exactly. All of the stuff about love and equality played down, and all the stuff about strength and whipping moneylenders played up, right? Okay.
And so the other thing would be like going back before Christianity on the spot. So to say in Germany, what was before Christianity, there was a belief system we could call pagan. Or heidnisch in German. So to revive this, they call themselves neo-pagan. But call it neo, this would mean you could recreate something that was there, but actually they just established it.
Right, because you're saying that because of this source critical problem that we've had, right? We've got this lack of sources. It requires so much invention that necessarily any form of paganism you tried to rediscover would actually involve quite a lot of invention, right?
If you take like one of the most leading groups in Germany still today, the so-called Armanenorden, which is a hardcore right-wing neo-pagan group, they believe that the Eddic texts were invented before the last ice period.
Good grief. Okay, so to put that into just by Eddic texts here, we're talking about these poems, which are recorded in Old Norse, recorded overwhelmingly, in fact, in a manuscript from the 1200s, but which we can see clearly are at least somewhat older than that, because they get quoted in lots of other things. And these are often taken to have special religious kind of significance, but they're really going and saying that they've got, in paganism, they're really saying something pretty special there. That's pre-Ice Age. That's thousands of years older than it could even potentially, older than the languages that they're even in, which they're written in Old Norse. Yeah, okay. That really is a search for the past, isn't it?
But I think we could actually go back to Renaissance humanism, when the first time this feeling of we did have something old here as well. It wasn't just the Romans with their Latin stuff and the Greeks with their gods, but we had something as well. This emerged in Sweden with Gothicism and came down to Germany as well. But then people like the Brothers Grimm took this up and tried to create out of the Old Norse mythology a German mythology, where they just recreated their own German way of thinking of a mythology.
This is it, isn't it? We complain about how few sources we have in Old Norse, or at least I was encouraging you to complain earlier now. But compared to the continental German situation, that you've actually, Old Norse has got a lot more there, right? There's no Middle High German equivalent to the sagas or to the Eddic material, and so yes, you've got to go, and if you want to recreate a Germanic belief system, whether you think that's English or whether you think that's German or whatever it is, you've actually often got to go shopping, as it were, in the Scandinavian aisle of the supermarket, right? You've got to go and plunder these Eddic materials.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we're actually, to some extent you already answered this, but what I'm wondering here is, these first neo-pagans, are there any salient points of difference they would have had with the last actual pagans? Is there anything you think we should draw attention to there in terms of how different these two things really were? Is it a different type of person? I don't know. What do you have to say to that?
I think what they're creating isn't primarily a mass phenomenon. They're not creating a religion for everyone. It's more occult, it's esoteric, and it's very elite. They always call themselves order of something or a special form of groups, which isn't for the common people.
Right, absolutely.
Of course, they should in the end, there should be a common Germanic religion, but what they do is like priesthood, what they think priesthood was.
And that's an important difference, isn't it? One of the many things that we don't know about paganism, at least if you ask me, is how they prayed. We have a couple of things in 13th century texts that claim to be pagan prayers, but I mean, it's extremely suspicious stuff. Long after paganism, we don't know really how they prayed. We have some idea how their priesthood works, perhaps, right, with the Gothi, or this sort of chieftain who's also a priest. But I mean, this is a radically different thing. If you want to make a religion here, you've actually got to really basic ingredients like liturgy. In prayer, you've got to start by, most generously, you could say reconstructing from other sources, and least generously, you could say making it up.
And even those reconstructions we have in the sagas, for example, if you think of Eyrbyggja saga.
So this is a saga from, the first half of the 1200s?
Yes.
Yeah, Iceland.
There we have this scene where they build a temple. But all we get is a somehow slightly paganized church.
That description does sound a lot like a church.
It's an altar with a bowl on it, and
there's a place for the congregation.
Exactly.
And, that's
exactly.
right. Yeah,
it's really it's just the interior of a church made up as pagan.
Well, this is it. There's a lot of people in the 1200s in Iceland, when they're writing this material about paganism, they're having to do a whole bunch of reconstruction themselves. Right?
Exactly.
This religion had been dead for 200 years, and then what's happening here in the 1800s, if I've understood you correctly, is you're trying to make another reconstruction out of the reconstruction.
That's what I would claim, yes.
Photocopy of a photocopy.
Yes, and then call it heritage.
Well, that, I think, leads us to this question of heritage. I mean, how large a role, how prominent a role has the far right or far right thinking played on neo-paganism?
A massive one.
Yeah.
Probably the only one.
Okay, yeah.
I would say at least in the German-speaking world, neo-paganism was, and I would say still is, linked extremely close to the far right and to Völkisch thinking.
I'm going to try to historicize it a little bit if possible. Was there a time when it was true to say that the majority of neo-pagan groups were far right? If we're here in the early 1800s, for example, these early Völkisch thinkers, are they all into far right politics, or are there some fragments who aren't? Or
I think in the Völkisch movement, all of them,
yeah, okay,
were. that's what the Völkisch movement represents. It's a far right bunch of different groups of people, seeing their German people and the folk as the main body. So they also used all these standard biological metaphors like Volkskörper, the people as one body, where you have to eliminate bad disease and bad parts of this body. So euthanasia was just part of their thinking, and racial breeding programs, actual breeding programs were thought of. Yeah, and many of those neo-pagan groups tried to have those breeding programs as well, and still do have.
So I want to... I'm going to try to imagine a listener here. Okay, I'm going to interpose an imaginary friend. I'm sure someone might be listening to this who themselves sees themselves as neo-pagan and says, "Hang on a second. I'm not far right. In fact, I'm very left wing. I vote for the Green Party or the Social Democrats." And if you go on the website of my neo-pagan congregation, you'll find a little disclaimer saying, love is love and everybody is welcome here of all backgrounds, and Óðinn hates racism and this kind of stuff. I'm upset by that. I'm imagining someone saying this, right? It's not my situation personally, but I mean, and there's something in that, right? I mean, it's not true today, surely, to say that the majority of neo-pagan groups are of a far-right persuasion.
I don't know. I wouldn't dare to say this for German neo-pagans.
Mm-hmm.
I would actually say most German neo-pagans tend to the right.
They do actually skew right in Germany.
Yes.
Yeah, that's
I can't. I don't have a good overview over the Scandinavian groups, but I think as soon as you start to dig a little bit deeper with their thoughts, most of them do have Völkisch undertones.
So you think it might well be possible to describe yourself as left-wing and vote Social Democrat and believe in be sort of pro-immigration and this kind of thing, but actually that there's a shaky basis, intellectual basis, that does have some far-right influence in it. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Because my main problem with it is, why would you claim a fantasy religion for yourself to be your heritage? Where does this come from? Why should any Danish person believe in Óðinn rather than something else? Does this help you? Is it more normal in the surroundings to do this? Is the country that keeps those spirits alive, or where's the link between...
What's special about Þór and Óðinn and Freyr?
And where's the link between modern days or present time and this fantasy religion?
And I can hear that in your thinking, it's the fantasiness, as it were. It's the fact that it's reconstructed that's a difference. I mean, for example, it sounds as though in this delineation, for example, a Dane, it could be a Swede, a Norwegian, an Englishman, I'm not really fussed, but who converts to Hinduism, say, that for you doesn't have these undertones, right? I mean, that's also a polytheistic kind of belief system of some type, but for you, the problem comes when you start to say, no, I'm not interested in Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, Christianity. The one for me is this. I need this one.
Exactly.
Yeah. Why does it have to be this one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And why do they believe in something? It's not even, you call it reconstructed, but what's the basis to reconstruct it? It's a reconstruction already, as we mentioned before. Yeah. It's texts written by Christian scribes. So, and you can't just try to scrap Christianity off those texts, because then we don't have anything.
Yeah, I mean, they're extremely Christian. They're just Christian literature.
Yeah, of course.
It's what it was. With the exception of runic inscriptions, there is no writing ever undertaken by a pagan hand.
Probably not.
That has survived to us at any rate.
Yeah.
I mean, that's leading me to wonder here How far is neo-paganism today, do you think, performing some sort of political values as opposed to some sort of sincere belief? And something I struggle with a little bit is, and I say this, I struggle with it because I struggle to understand it as someone who is not neo-pagan. Do people really, in their hearts today, believe that Thor and Óðinn, are up there watching them? Will people go out and die for Óðinn in the way that Christians have been known to die for Christ, or Muslims to die for Allah? Is neo-paganism really inspiring sincere religious belief, or is it doing this some sort of political work? Is it articulating a certain vision of how you wish society were? For example, you wish we were in the good old days, right, or whatever that might be. Is that a question we can answer? Is it even a question we should broach?
I think those are different questions. One is with this altar, I think, yes, we do have right-wing terrorists manifestos which relate to Óðinn and Þór and neo-pagan beliefs. Yeah. So yes, people
are willing to commit violence, yes, and to be victims of violence, theoretically, for it. Yeah.
But on the other hand, I'm not a believer myself. I don't believe in a higher power, so it's difficult for me to say that they do believe or don't believe in those things. But as you say, I think the main thing behind it is some form of reenactment, some form of trying to live in a different culture, and this cultural criticism behind it, I think, has right-wing tendencies to see something which was as better than it is today. And yes, it's far off.
It sounds to me that to be a neo-pagan, you essentially have to believe that a historical mistake was made when the conversion to Christianity happened, and we have to go back and we have to fix that mistake.
And that's a tendency I think is not very liberal, left-wing, or in any way progressive.
And of course I should say, and I know this because I've heard people say it, and it's not my view, but that some neo-pagans would say, oh, but you look at all the terrible right-wing things that Christianity did, right? Oppression of women, most obviously. That's why we need to go back. That's why we need to have paganism. They would say, no, we're doing this as a left-wing thing, right?
If you look at those rallies in the US, those neo-Nazi rallies,
Unite the Right kind of stuff.
Yeah, neo-pagans marched alongside clan members and alongside hardcore Christians. So they don't split up. Their hatred against everything else is bigger than the actual religious belief they try to perform.
And I should be clear here, you're talking about those particular neo-pagans. Exactly. I know we're obviously not talking about all neo-pagans.
No.
Something I wonder about, I'm going to mention producer Kirsi here and say producer Kirsi might want to cut this. I don't know if we can mention this really. I don't know if it's relevant to, but I often think, I think this is interesting, this discussion of neo-pagan belief. You're coming at it, Lukas, as a non-believer, right? As someone who actually doesn't have religious belief at all. I normally try to keep my religion out of my work as far as I think that's possible. But I am a believer, just not in neo-paganism, right? And my faith, I have the confidence in my faith that it is not some sort of historical mistake, right? And I realize that our faith has to change in the society that it's in. And also, I'm very clear that my faith will survive without me. If I lose my faith and I stop believing, my faith will continue to be there. There are still buildings that are of my faith that will continue to be. This tradition, this belief will carry on happening without me. And I do wonder what it does to neo-paganism that it can't necessarily say that. Neo-paganism is in a position where it does have to be willed into belief, and where you do have to say, actually, there was a mistake here, right? And that's why this religion was lost, and we had to go back and do all of these complicated intellectual maneuvers in order to save it. I once heard it said by a neo-pagan of neo-paganism that neo-paganism is a religion that comes with homework, because there's so much reading of scholarship you have to do to to make it work as a religion. And I think the question there in my mind is, wouldn't it be good to have a religion that didn't need homework? Where you didn't have to do a lot of work just to establish, the basic things about how to pray and how to come together.
But you still have to learn it in other religions too.
Yes, that's true. You do have to be educated as a Christian or Muslim or a Jew.
But neo-paganism is a new faith movement.
Mm, yeah.
It's a created religion, so they do have to create and create and create because they don't have a basis, they don't have a dogma.
Yeah.
And so that's probably why they also try to bring it back to something before history, before historical writing, because then you can fill it with whatever wish you have.
Yeah.
It can be whatever you want it to be. It can be your pure racial dream of Aryan people. It doesn't have to be like something that is actually established.
That leads us to the question of breaking with this Völkisch past, right? Because the fact that it's a bit of a tabula rasa, it's a thing you can project your own desires onto. I think that's why some people who think of themselves as left-wing, I know that you would say that they've got this sort of rotten foundation, but are attracted to it. And I can say that, no, this is about, I worship the mother and this is about freeing women, and women were freer in the Viking Age. Of course, as historians, we know that that's absolutely not true, but that's a thing you can believe. That's a desire you can have, a thing you can wish to be true. When did neo-pagans start trying to break with their Völkisch past?
I think it started after Second World War, that some groups, at least in the late 60s, started to rethink their system of belief or the basis, as you called it, the rotten one. And there were those feminist, eco-critical people who started this hippie movement, New Age, hippie, esoteric neo-paganism.
I think that's the thing a lot of people will think of in the English-speaking world anyway, when they think of neo-paganism.
But still, if you go there and look at what the basis of their beliefs are, you always come back to Völkisch thinkers just because they read scholarship. And that's one of the main problems, even in our field. The giants on which shoulders we dwarfs are standing are Völkisch, and they were Nazis.
Yeah, it was a surprising number of Nazis still being cited in Old Norse. I mean, and we're not talking here, for the listeners, we should be clear. Some of these people had uniforms. I mean, they were people like Jan de Vries, right, had posed for portraits in his SS uniform.
Of course. Yeah.
He was a Dutch philologist and historian of religion who, when the Allies invaded the Netherlands, there was a demographic kind of crisis because everybody in the country tried to move west to get to be behind Allied lines. He was the only guy going east, right? I mean, him and a few other collaborators. But yeah, we are still carrying that history around. I mean, is there, in the universities today, how far are neo-pagans active in reproducing Völkisch scholarship? Are there neo-pagan historians of religion?
I do think so, yeah.
Today,
of course. Yeah. We have a lot of students being neo-pagan when they. That's why they are attracted
I've taught a number of neo-pagan students.
That's why they're attracted to the field.
Yeah,
often so. But it's good if they learn that it's not all brown and dark and Nazi in our field, but we can show them that there is problematic parts with their belief system, and maybe they change or they don't.
I'm going to try to end on a positive note.
Yes, please.
And I have a feeling I'm going to fail, but I'm going to try. Could there, if we allow ourselves to really imagine very far in the future, in your view, could a form of neo-paganism ever exist that would be free of Völkisch tendencies? Could we ever achieve a truly anti-fascist neo-paganism?
Actually, I don't think so, because the cultural criticism in it, the critic of present time society, the thought of old times being better than today, that's something very conservative, very traditional, and often very right-wing. So it's probably problematic to have a purely anti-fascist neo-pagan movement.
Lukas, I haven't asked you to prepare for this question. It's just another desperate bid to end on a positive note. But if there was one work of scholarship, could be a book, could be an article, could be in English, could be in German, could be in a Scandinavian language. If there was one work of scholarship you would recommend to someone to read about paganism, whether that's neo-paganism or however it was paganism looked in the 700s and 800s, is there something you would recommend to listeners?
I would definitely recommend everything written by my colleague Stefanie von Schnurbein. She's professor of modern Scandinavian literature at Nordeuropa-Institut at Humboldt-Universität. She wrote, for example, the book in English, Norse Revival, which is one of the best compendium on modern-day neo-paganism. And she did a lot of field work within those groups.
Well, you heard it there. Get your hands on Norse Revivals. Lukas, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me.
The Chronicles was funded by Aarhus Universitets Forskningsfond. Sound production and original music was by Kirsi Tilk of Tilk Sonics. If you're interested in news and events at the Centre, you can visit our website at cas.au.dk/cvm. I've been Richard Cole. Thank you for listening.